Thank you so much for that introduction. Just testing the mic is okay here. Thank you all for coming tonight for the launch of this absolutely wonderful book, about which I will say a bit more in due course. I've been reading and teaching Rahul's work for quite a few years, so I knew it was going to be good, but it really is astounding. The way that we're going to proceed tonight is that Rahul is going to say a little bit about the motivation and content of the book. I'm going to pose a couple of questions off the back of that. Then we'll go back to Rahul for a short reading from one of the chapters. I might ask another question or two, depending on how we go for time, and then we'll make sure that we turn over to the floor so that you can all weigh in as well. So with that said, Rahul, if you'd like to kick us off.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Can you hear me at the back? Great. I was just saying to Paul, when I was a kid and had birthday parties, I was always paranoid that no one would come. So it's amazing to see all of you here. Thank you so much for coming to this event, which is the first event around the book, which makes it both very exciting and slightly nerve-wracking for me. I have a few thank yous. First to Pluto Press and to my editor, David Schulman, for allowing me to write the kind of book I wanted to write. To Hausmans for hosting this event. Thank you so much. To Paul, who has a role to play in the fact that this is a book. It began life as a series of blogs on The Disorder of Things, which is a blog that Paul set up together with friends of his and people who became my friends as well. And I used to contribute sporadically and slightly manically to this blog, very occasionally, but when I did, you know, they were quite long posts. And after 3,000 word posts, Paul gently took me aside and said, maybe there's a book in this. And I'm not sure whether that was because the posts had anything of value in them or because maybe there were too many statues on the blog. But either way, I think that conversation was very formative for me and very encouraging as a reason to write the book. It's a particular thrill in that sort of uncanny way where the line between fiction and non-fiction is completely blurred, to be launching this book here because I happen to be reading Andrew O'Hagan's Caledonian Road, like half of the UK. And Hausman's Bookshop makes an appearance on page 42 of my edition of the book. And the character Milo Mangasha walks past the shop, and the narrator tells us that he had not long ago bought a book at Hausman's Bookshop called Policing the Black Man. Policing the Black Man is a real book. It's an anthology of perspectives on Black Lives Matter, edited by Angela Davis. And in a sense, The Psychic Lives of Statues begins with Policing the Black Man, not that book itself, but with the issues that it grapples with. Even if you never gave statues a second thought, in the summer of 2020, you probably cottoned on to the fact that they had become centers of controversy, particularly for struggles around race. In the United States, in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests that followed that, and then very quickly in the UK, in other parts of Europe, in Latin America, in the Caribbean, in South Africa, in Australia, and places much further afield. It wasn't the first time, of course, that statues had become controversial. There has been a long-running struggle against Confederate statues in the United States and symbols of the Confederacy. There was a particular spike around those kinds of statues and symbols around 2015 when a white supremacist named Dylan Roof killed 9 African-American people in a church in Charleston, South Carolina. He was discovered to have posted a manifesto on the internet in which he posed with symbols of the Confederacy, which he was obviously enthralled to and inspired by to commit these murderous acts. And so that renewed the struggle against symbols of the Confederacy. which again spiked in 2017 during the first Donald Trump administration. I mentioned Trump's name on the first page of the book, and at the time that it went to press, I felt like this was a bit of a throwback and perhaps unnecessary, and I'm glad my editor convinced me that that might not be the case, because here we are again in another Trump moment when the so-called culture wars around race have been renewed with vengeance and are taking newer and more cancerous forms. But I first started thinking about statues in 2015, earlier in 2015, when a movement called Rhodes Must Fall erupted in Cape Town in South Africa, and then very quickly after that in Oxford in the UK. The movement in Cape Town was a movement demanding the removal of a statue of Cecil Rhodes, arch Victorian settler colonist who played an outsized role in the colonization of Southern Africa, not just South Africa, but the countries that became Zimbabwe and Zambia. If I were writing the book today, in 2025, I would probably describe Rhodes as the Elon Musk of the 19th century, or maybe I would describe Musk as the Rhodes of the 21st century. And I'm not saying that just to give you a kind of cute soundbite to make you buy the book, because actually I don't make that comparison in the book. But I think when you read about Rhodes, it becomes very clear that these are the sort of progenitors, in ways we can talk about in more detail, of our contemporary moment of settler colonial solidarity, if you like, that we're seeing today. So Rhodes Must Fall was not just a demand about a statue. The statue was a metaphor for a broader movement against the enduring legacies of apartheid in South Africa, which the movement saw visible in the continuing whiteness of the university, the campus, the curriculum, the community itself. And it was quickly picked up in the UK because Rhodes, of course, came from the UK and is intensively memorialized here, in part because of his philanthropy to the University of Oxford in the form of the Rhodes Scholarships. And that mattered to me because I came to the UK on a Rhodes Scholarship from India. And so my own migration, mobility in both geographical and class and all sorts of other terms was premised on the wealth that Rhodes extracted from Southern Africa and institutionalized in the form of this scholarship. So grappling with Rhodes Must Fall required me to interrogate my own privilege in being in a position in the Indian context to even be competitive, is the word we use for these sorts of so-called meritocratic things. To even be in a position to apply for and to win a scholarship like that takes a huge amount of privilege, which in the Indian context has to be understood in terms of caste and class. And so thinking about Rhodes Must Fall required me to think about race and caste. And that interrogation is very visible in the Indian context today, particularly in the form of statue politics. It takes a very different form than it does in the West, where it isn't so much about statues being toppled as statues being built by different religious and caste communities in a kind of rivalry with one another, which I can also talk a bit more about. In fact, India is going through a frenetic period of statue construction. The tallest statue in the world, twice the size of the Statue of Liberty, is currently in India, in Gujarat, in Western India, in the Prime Minister's home state. There's a whole chapter in the book about the so-called Statue of Unity, and the picture on the cover is an image of that statue, which I write about in quite a lot of detail. So the kinds of questions I was preoccupied with grappling with, my motivations for writing the book, were first to think about why statues had become terrains for racial and caste politics in this way, for the assertion of racial and caste supremacy, but also for the contestation of those things. I wanted to understand or place in the same frame both construction and toppling, because these are processes that are unfolding simultaneously in different parts of the world. And I also wanted to try and explain to myself, but also to anybody who was puzzled about why an inanimate object like a statue might arouse such intense feeling in people, to the point where they were driven to destroy or topple, or indeed to defend those statues with such great fervor. I can say more about the arguments in the book as we go along, and I'm sure we'll get to them. But I think briefly I would say that I'm trying to convey 4 things in the book. I want to show that the furore around these statues is often not just about white supremacy, but is also an expression of discontent against older ways of fighting white supremacy. So Rhodes Must Fall, for example, was not just a protest against the endurance of apartheid logics in South Africa. It was also a protest against the Mandela generation for not doing enough to dismantle those legacies. And likewise, a movement called Gandhi Must Fall, quite different in some ways, despite the apparent similarity in the names, was really a protest that began in Ghana but had imitators all over the world, where movements of different kinds expressed a kind of animosity towards Gandhi that comes from many different reasons and motivations. I wanted to remind readers that, it's easy sitting in the Western metropolis to think that the statue is a Victorian obsolete form. But by reminding readers that statues are still being built on ever more monumental scales, I wanted to convey that these were still modes in which communities were asserting pride, claiming space, making a kind of politics for themselves. I found that statues were being both toppled and erected in the name of something called decolonisation. If you're sick of that word, so am I. It's a very confusing word in the way in which it's deployed today. It is used by both people constructing and destroying statues to justify what they're doing. It's used both by racists and anti-racists to explain what they're about. And so one of the things the book tries to do is to navigate its way through these confusing and complicated deployments of decolonization. And finally, this is a book about identity, my own, but I hope yours as well. Some of the book is written in the register of memoir because I toyed with the idea of calling it My Psychic Life in Statues, which it really is. I mean, why did you choose to write about these statues? Because they call to me in some way, and I'm quite explicit about why they do that. But I hope it's not just about me. I hope it gives people a way to think about the built environment around us as a portal into the deeper conversations that I think we want to have around race, caste, and decolonization.
Thank you. I know that many people got a copy of the book with their ticket, but I feel like part of my job is also to sell the book a bit before we get into questions for those who didn't. So I'm going to do that for a minute or two before I pose the first question to Rahul. I really do think that this is a book that cements Rahul's place as one of the most agile and astute and worldly public intellectuals of our time. I think it is an extraordinary achievement. And I want to pick out just 3 of its qualities for you. The first is that although it's about statues, it also, to me, breaks the bounds of the debate on statues, at least as it exists in the UK. So it really avoids the trap of arguing about the specific historical merits of this or that figure, this or that statue, in the way that I think the British debate has tended to. It does not, if you think about the memory wars, do the close combat of saying, here's the list of things about Cecil Rhodes that were good, and here's the list of things that were bad. It's much more agile, and I was trying to think in martial metaphors. If it's not the close combat of the memory wars, what is it? And I think Rahul acts as something like a war artist, right? He's partisan, he belongs to one side, but he's able to paint a picture and tell a truth that exceeds that positionality. The second quality, which Rahul's already touched on, is that the book advances a kind of critique of decoloniality, and a critique in the best sense of working within a tradition to which you are in some way aligned or in some way sympathetic, but to really bring out its tensions and limitations and maybe to point to something which comes afterwards. And it does so in just a hugely ambitious and agile kind of way. It's part travelogue, but in travelling it expands out from the provincialism of British debates about imperial decline and postcolonial nostalgia and such things into a much, much richer transnational web. And then the third quality is this psychic quality, which is that my reading of what Rahul has done here is that it's not just a focus on statues as spectacular focal points of ideology or as superficial relics which displace the true struggle over power and resources, but statues as kind of endemic, banal, a web of sometime anchors in our lives. And that puts them in much richer historical and political context. It's also compulsively readable and really achieves that balance between having a series of academic reference points and trails that you can follow, but whilst maintaining this really astounding pace and readability. So, all of that said, some questions to get us going. The first is, what for you comes after fallism, which is the term that we kind of use for these movements against statues, right? Towards the end of the book, you write about the mausoleum to Nkrumah in Ghana, which features at the front a very standard heroic portrayal of the striding nationalist leader. And at the back has a damaged prior statue which had been attacked partly by his Ghanaian critics in his autocratic period. And you seem to suggest that that's a kind of model for what statue politics could be. But from a British perspective, to become parochial once again, I wanted to know more about how you think that would play out if we're talking about a figure like a Colston or a Churchill or a Rhodes.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I was really intrigued by this mausoleum of Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, in Accra, which, as Paul just described, has both a statue glorifying him in front and a very damaged statue battered by his critics at the back. And they're all displayed on the same site. So it's really like this sort of palimpsestic site that tells you how everybody has thought about Nkrumah over the entirety of his, the aftermath of his life. What would that look like for figures like Rhodes? I mean, the thing that makes that possible with Nkrumah is that he has this outsized stature as the redeemer, the liberator of the nation, but is also heavily criticized for his dictatorial tendencies and for his authoritarianism. And so the reason that site works is because there are redeeming qualities, even in the face of those kinds of critiques. I suppose the question that leaves us in the British context is, do these figures, Churchill, Rhodes, Colston, have those kinds of redeeming qualities? And I'm not sure they do. I'm not sure that the reasons they're remembered and celebrated, Colston and Rhodes, for example, today, is primarily for their philanthropy. In effect, the money has helped to whitewash the implication and coloniality of these figures. And the decision for us is, to think about whether we are willing to let, one side of that balance sheet compensate for or whitewash the other. In effect, they have bought their place in posterity with capital. And that's not a very unusual phenomenon. I mean, most of these great men of empire, most of the figures we venerate today, most of the people who could afford to have statues of themselves built and to occupy public space in this way were exactly men of capital, or whether that was political or economic. And And in effect, that has bought their place in posterity and preserves their place in posterity. So when Oriel College in Oxford was contemplating conducting a sort of what they called a listening exercise to see if the statue could be removed, they received a slew of complaints from their own donors, who were probably anxious about their place in posterity if the philanthropist par excellence was dislodged from collective memory. So money is still being used to thwart the politics of decolonization. We have only to look at how donors have responded to Palestine solidarity protests to see that money at work in those same ways. It's not the only reason that institutions are cracking down on Palestine solidarity, but it is a very important part of what's going on in the current moment. So I'm not sure that what I say about Nkrumah can be easily applied to these other figures. Nkrumah is a complex figure in which there is both the possibility of liberation as well as the disappointment. That's not the case with many of these arch colonialist figures who were really about extraction and colonization, and about whom, yes, we can tell complicated stories, but at the end of that complexity, we still have to come to a view on whether these are people we want to build our identities around or not. And that's really the question that these iconoclastic movements have brought to the forefront. That's the reckoning that they've forced. And I think sometimes we do have to answer those questions categorically rather than say it's complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. I think on that question of identity, one of the things you said about the book is that you were thinking about subtitling it, my psychic life in statues. It does have this kind of autobiographical quality, and it's often surprisingly intimate and moving in the way that you link those political debates and those objects to your own kind of trajectory. So, I wanted to ask a little bit about the effect of writing the book on you. There's something that you say in chapter 2, which is, it is only with defacement that the statue comes into its own. I thought that was quite a very powerful kind of statement, which we'll also come back to when we talk about public memory and the memory wars. But defacement is, in other words, something that's generative and libidinal. So for you, in the process of researching statues and thinking more about statues, presumably more than you ever had before, what did that do to you? What did that open up and generate for your psychic life?
Yeah. There's a great essay by Robert Musil, which many people have quoted, about how statues are really boring and unnoticed most of the time. And I kind of read that essay as suggesting that most people ignore most statues most of the time in most places, right? Probably not a wise thing to say in a book about statues, but I think it's actually true. We walk past them all the time and don't give a shit. In part because they're covered with bird shit. But until something happens, until the statue is defaced, until it's attacked, until somebody attacks it, the moment of defacement is paradoxically the moment in which the statue comes alive. And so these particular instances of defacement and iconoclasm, yes, they did open up big questions for me, and sometimes unexpected questions. I didn't expect thinking about Rhodes Must Fall to lead into a reckoning with caste and caste privilege. It's not the most automatic connection. Certainly it wasn't quite what the movements were talking about. But it is the kind of reckoning that opened up for me. I had to start asking questions about the history of the scholarships, who got these scholarships. And that tells a different story in different countries, right? So very few black scholars in the United States. There's there are exceptions to that trend, but they're almost accidental. Very few black scholars in South Africa till very recently. I'm not sure there's ever been a reckoning of the caste basis of who has got these scholarships in India, but they tended to go to, and still go to, students who are in elite institutions, to which access is also mediated by caste. So it was somewhat unexpected, the kinds of connections that I was forced to draw. And yet, when you open the door, the questions kind of suggest themselves quite naturally. There's a chapter about Gandhi. Critiques of Gandhi have been very long running, beginning from his own time. But there is something interesting about why the critiques have acquired salience and power and depth in this moment. So we're not actually learning anything about Gandhi that we didn't already know. He is a very public figure who writes very publicly and very copiously about every subject under the sun. So this is not a story about somebody finding a smoking gun that wasn't in the public domain, but it is about the increasing salience of arguments that he was racist, casteist, misogynistic. It's about movements becoming powerful and being able to say in the world and credibly things that have always already been said. I think about the Me Too movement as a kind of counterpart to that. Again, open secrets being made public and credible in ways that have consequences. And you know, in the Indian political firmament, we're seeing a sort of gradual decline of Gandhi and the resurgence of these other political figures, both on the right and the left. So certainly Ambedkar, who's an icon for the Dalit movement, and of whom there are probably more statues in India than anyone else. But also the heroes of the Hindu right, who are increasingly dominant in the visual iconography of Indian public political life. And for me, that was an index of how India is changing, has been changing since 2014 onwards. So writing about that was also a way of registering my dissent against what's happening in India, of adding my voice to the many countless people who are doing this in all sorts of ways, many much more publicly and at much greater risk than I am. And then there were some unexpected kinds of statue encounters. For various reasons that I talk about in the book, I moved to Scotland and I moved to the Hebrides, to the islands off the west coast of Scotland. And it felt very out of place because there are almost no people of color there. Or so I thought. And it was through an encounter with the mausoleum of Lachlan Macquarie, who is from Alva, which is an island off Mull, but who is now embraced as a kind of son of Mull, goes off to New South Wales as the fifth governor, founds the colonial city of Sydney, or what is called Sydney by so-called Australia and Australians. And Macquarie is this outsized late 18th, 19th century figure whose career spans continents, service in the American Revolutionary War and briefly in the Caribbean and a long period in India and then Australia and then back to the UK. And I sort of, in following his life, discovered all of these moments where they weirdly came very close to things in my own life. In ways that the last chapter describes. So yeah, and what that did was it curiously spoke to why I had a reason to be in Mull, quite apart from the idiosyncrasies of my life. So I call this chapter, "We Are Here Because You Were There." And while I was writing, when I first moved there, the question I kept asking myself was, what the hell am I doing here? And Shivanandan's "We Are Here Because You Were There" was a kind of answer to that question. And so it's really about the sort of dialectic between those two statements. What the hell am I doing here? We are here because you were there.
I mean, it really speaks to the narrative brio of the book that there's a kind of spoiler in the last chapter that we're avoiding talking about, right? So I would encourage you to get to that so you can see what we're alluding to. You mentioned that one of the things in the book is the focus on the construction of statues and particularly how that plays out in the Indian context. And I think we're going to have a short reading from the chapter that deals with that, and then I will turn over to the audience after that.
So this is the chapter about the Statue of Unity, the tallest statue in the world, for now, although there are bigger statues being planned in India by other actors and states. And you know, it's a longish, complicated story that begins with colonial governmentality in the late 19th century. The British colonial government introduces a very limited franchise, elections to legislative bodies, and this makes communities very conscious of their numerical strength. It's important for communities to be as big as possible in order to wield electoral power. And so upper caste Hindus in that moment, for the first time, decide that subordinate castes should be treated as Hindus for the purpose of wielding electoral power. Not in a way that dismantles the caste system. So what they want is a sort of hierarchical but unified Hindu community in which caste is preserved, but all of these castes are considered Hindu. And one of the ways in which they do this is through visual icons. So for many years around that time, subordinate caste movements had been demanding entry into Hindu temples. Dominant caste Hindus did not want to concede that demand, but they also wanted to give subordinate castes something, some crumbs with which to satisfy that demand. So instead of allowing them into the temple, they brought the icons out in public processions, in festivals, such as the Ganapati Utsav in Maharashtra around the god Ganesha, or the Durga Puja in Bengal. And so these icons would be carried in public processions. This was a way of consolidating community and sort of identifying and also claiming territory. But perhaps the most institutionalized form of doing this was to actually build statues. Carrying an icon in a procession on the date of a festival is a once-in-a-year occurrence, but building a statue is permanent. And that way of asserting community identity and claiming territory really takes off in the 1960s when the Dalit community begins to build statues of Ambedkar, who is the preeminent Dalit leader, but also the architect of the Indian Constitution. So, he's this outsized intellectual and political figure who is memorialized by the Dalit community in statues. This is a story that Kajri Jain tells very well in her book, Gods in the Time of Democracy, and I rely on her work for some of this historical account. The dominant caste Hindus respond to this wave of Dalit statue building by building statues of their own icons on ever greater scales. So what the Dalit community does in terms of number, the Hindu right does in terms of size. And Jain argues that the size of these statues seem to increase exponentially in the 1980s when liberalization begins in India, and some industries like cement and real estate and automobiles and road construction take off in a big way. Cities are expanding, and you sort of see this urban sprawl and a sort of peri-urban creep into areas that were previously rural. And one way in which this was done was by building statues of Hindu icons in places that were previously jungle, as a way of persuading caste Hindus that the land was safe for habitation, that it was land that could be urbanized in a sense. So the statues can be read here as a kind of advance guard of how capitalism works and how a sort of urbanizing capitalism is working in this context. But I think there's more going on, especially at the psychic level, and this is where I want to read. So this is towards the end of the chapter on the Statue of Unity, which I call the Statue of Impunity for various reasons that I spell out. And what I'm trying to get at here is what purchase do the statues have on the psyche? Right? Why are these statues being built? And particularly by the Hindu right in this moment. So the question that remains to be addressed is why statues have this intoxicating effect. And this word intoxicating is something that the Dalit Marxist Anand Teltumre uses to talk about what statues do. What thirst do they quench? It is instructive to turn here to the work of the great African-American sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois. Preoccupied, like Marx and Ambedkar, with the question of why class revolution was unlikely to materialize in racially divided societies, Du Bois offers a persuasive account of why white workers in the postbellum US were more likely to identify with white elites than with black workers. He argues that while white workers received a low wage, they were compensated in part by a sort of public and psychological wage. And this concept has been taken up by lots of people. The wages of whiteness is how it's often glossed. This wage took a variety of forms, including being given public deference and titles of courtesy, access to white-only public facilities in the segregated South, recruitment into the lower echelons of the administration, entitlement to the franchise, and lenient treatment by the courts. This is especially in the US South. Black workers, of course, got none of this and were subject, in addition, to everyday humiliations that reiterated their inferiority, public insult, and at the most heinous end of this spectrum of discrimination, mob lynchings. White elites benefited most from this system because, and I quote Du Bois here, the wages of both classes could be kept low, the whites fearing to be supplanted by Negro labor, the Negroes always being threatened by the substitution of white labor, unquote. Among the many things that comprised the public and psychological wage given to white labor were the statues honoring Confederate political and military figures who had fought in the US Civil War to uphold slavery, which came to pockmark the southern US states like a rash in the early and mid-20th century. Together with the other non-monetary and symbolic benefits that Du Bois identifies, they stymied the development of class consciousness among white labor by offering visual proof in the built environment of their racial supremacy. In a close reading of Du Bois's work, Ella Myers has argued that what she calls the gratifications of whiteness include, and I quote, not only material goods and status benefits, but also pleasures derived from gratuitous black suffering and the faith-like conviction that the world belongs to those marked as white, unquote. Confederate statues bolstered this conviction by demonstrating an ownership of and mastery over public space. Yet they also sought to keep white workers in their place. Erin Thompson, who's an art historian, in a book called Smashing Statues, points out that many Confederate statues are not of leaders, but of the ordinary soldier, who is depicted in a position known as parade rest, a stance in which he would have stood in parade while awaiting instruction from his superior officer. These monuments do not laud Confederate soldiers for their skill or courage, but for their obedience. Built especially in periods of labor unrest, when the specter of racial unity among the working classes haunted white elites, the statues attempted both to elevate white workers over black ones and to subordinate them to the white plantocracy. The electoral strategy of the BJP, now shifting to the Indian context, has long rested on two planks. The material wage offered by the promise of what they call vikas, development in Hindi, and the psychological wage of Hindu supremacy. Recognizing that people do not live by bread alone, the psychological wage responds to a complex and confusing amalgam of psychic needs, both legitimate and not: dignity, recognition, respect, izzat, the desire to recuperate a lost or failed masculinity, and pride in the glory of a lost Vedic golden age. And it is dispersed, this psychological wage of Hinduness, through a now familiar array of mechanisms and campaigns that endlessly reiterate Hindu supremacy, including the construction of temples and statues, the lynching of minorities — lynching is now a word that has entered the Indian lexicon — and the increasingly strident policing of whom one can love, where one can live, and what one can eat, wear, read, and say. As Du Bois points out, the psychological wage does not simply supplement the material wage, but also supplants it, blinding its beneficiaries to how their material interests remain unsatisfied while suturing them to their better-off racial, religious, and caste brethren. In this regard, it is a crucial device through which the BJP broadens its electoral base, allowing oppressed castes to feel the gratifications and intoxications of Hinduness, and in doing so, preventing the formation of alliances with Muslims and other non-Hindus without in any way dismantling the stratifications of caste. Scholars of Hindutva have shown how participation in the vigilante activities of Hindu supremacist organizations seems to assuage the frustration engendered by the gap between the aspirations and the actual prospects of the angry young men and some women who provide its shock troops. Hindutva's psychological wage is shot through with pleasure, apparent in the avidness with which videos of mob lynchings, gang rapes, and other acts of gratuitous violence against minorities are circulated and consumed on social media and messaging platforms, and in the recreational opportunities provided by nationalist sites of myth-making and maza, meaning fun, sites like the Statue of Unity. It brings with it the illusion of ownership that comes from the magisterial refashioning of entire landscapes to better accord with the Hindu symbolic imaginary. In delivering gratification, intoxication, pleasure, and ownership, the psychological wage operates as a bulwark, protecting the party, in this case the BJP, against the flood of rage that might otherwise engulf it, as those drawn into its electoral constituency find themselves disappointed by the hollow slogans and jobless growth that it delivers. Dams remain temples in contemporary India, but statues and temples have also become dams. And the reference to dams being temples is a famous statement that Nehru makes when he's inaugurating a dam in early postcolonial India as a symbol of its modernity. I'll just say one more sentence about that. The reason I talk about dams and statues together is because the Statue of Unity is built on the site of an extremely controversial dam on the Narmada River, which displaced 250,000 people on a conservative estimate from the 1990s onwards. And the Statue of Unity is kind of the icing on this terrible cake that is a sort of triumphant capstone on this project of extractive capitalism in the Narmada Valley, which has displaced hundreds of thousands of mostly indigenous people.
Because I'd like to come back maybe then to this question of the psychic life and the power of statues, which you've been elaborating on somewhat, in two directions. One is the kind of contrast, and maybe you can say more about how you reconcile this observation that statues are kind of banal and forgettable and we mainly walk past them, and for all of the discourse around statues somehow teaching us history, most of us have no idea who these figures are or what they represent or what they did, and we certainly don't learn it by looking at the statue, right? So we have on this one hand this idea of the statue is quite marginal and forgettable, but you also want to link it to these very powerful psychic libidinal investments that mobilize whole communities, that keep governments in power, that do that. So one kind of question is around that side of the psychic and libidinal charge. And the other, to pick up on one of the questions already asked, is about whether we can do without statues, or maybe better put, without icons, because I think some of the themes coming out here are whether or not we need to mobilize counter icons, whether it's possible to have movements, radical movements, without some kind of iconography, and that actually the example that you use in the book of the statue, I think it's the Wollstonecraft statue, which is not of her but of a figure who is supposed to represent sort of womankind. It seems at one level like that's a counter move, a rejoinder to conventional statue politics, but also in some ways it seems to fail because it doesn't do that mobilizing work that a statue of Wollstonecraft herself might have done. So maybe you can just say a bit more about those.
Yeah. So the first question, I guess, is how can a statue be both banal and boring and have these psychic charges that I'm alluding to in the title? And I think that psychic charge is not a constant. It is particularly pronounced at the moment the statues are built, when there's a lot of fuss around them and they're sending signals to particular audiences and constituencies. This is for you, this land is yours, etc. And when they're defaced. So it's the moment of erection, to use a phallic word, and of defacement, ejaculation even, that is the sort of, those are the moments where the psychic charge is most visible, most palpable, most obvious. In between, the statue disappears. It's there, but who sees it, right? So I think those moments are quite powerful, but they are moments. They're not. They don't endure. And this is the other paradox about statues. They're built to make somebody immortal, but as they persist in time, they stop discharging that function because the person gets forgotten. Your second question was about this need for icons. And I think about this towards the end of the book. I think about, the busts of Marx all over the place, but think of the one in Highgate and how it's a sort of, the way people go there almost on a pilgrimage and pose with that image. Or indeed of the statues of Ambedkar, which arguably are the most visible symbol of Dalit assertion and resurgence in India today. And yes, I think we need icons. But I'm always worried that the iconization of figures sets them up for capture, appropriation, in the way that we're seeing happen with decolonization, but also sets them up to fall, right? Things can't fall unless they're put up on pedestals. So would not putting things up on pedestals have the effect of allow us to develop a different relationship with decolonial icons? It's striking, for example, that there are no statues of Fanon. And I would actually be quite worried if we started seeing statues of Fanon all over the place. And I take some hope actually in iconoclastic readings of icons. And I find this in movements like Rhodes Must Fall, particularly the feminist and the queer bits of Rhodes Must Fall, which were very critical of a more masculinist interpretation of Fanon that was circulating within these movements and that has always circulated. And I sort of think that if we could develop an iconoclastic reading of our decolonial icons, that would avert this danger of them being trophies for capture or set up to fall in the way that, everybody is fallible. Everyone is going to fall or fail in some way or the other. And yet, how do we hold out the liberatory possibilities that they offer nonetheless, despite that?
On that note, thank you so much for coming out tonight. I understand that Rahul is willing to sign books if anybody would like that to happen. He'll hang around for a little while to do that. But it leaves only to join me in thanking him for his time and for the book. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.